Welcome back to The Heat. We're talking about the ongoing civil war in Syria and the resulting refugee crisis across the region. Here with us now is Rafif Joueiati, spokeswoman for the network of activists known as the Local Coordinating Committees in Syria, and from Ottawa, Canada, Mahdi Nazemroaya, a research associate with the Center for Research on Globalization. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Rafif, as we heard, the situation in Syria is getting worse. I mean, can you believe that it is getting worse? There's a looming food shortage right now. There are medical shortages. We're hearing that even shelter may be threatened right now. Isn't it time for the Syrian government to enter now and do something about this?
That's a very good question. It has been time for the regime of Bashar al-Assad to do something. The situation has been steadily worsening since March of 2011 when the revolution began. So yes, you would think that logically the regime that purports to be the government in charge would be doing something to stem the flow of blood and to feed the hungry.
Mahdi, isn't it time for the Syrian government to take to show that it's responsible for what is happening to its people and take action right now?
I think that the Syrian government is showing that taking responsibility for the internally displaced people inside Syria. They don't refer to them as refugees, they call them internally displaced. But I think it has shown a great deal of responsibility towards them. Whether you find it as a legitimate government or not, I think they've been trying their best to help the internally displaced people in there. They don't want to turn people against them. They don't want to aggravate the situation more. They're doing their best to calm down the situation. And I wouldn't, there's plenty of blame to go all around. I mean, I wouldn't just blame the government in Damascus, regardless of how you interpret it as democratic or not. I would not put all the blame on that government. There's also other players involved here, including the militias such as the Free Syrian Army, the al-Nusra, there's also ISIL or ISIS, Daesh, and of course there's countries and players like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the United States, Britain, France. So I mean, there's plenty of blame to go all around. I wouldn't exclusively put this on the shoulders of the government in Syria. We have to understand, if we want to deal with the humanitarian crisis in that country, and there is one, we have to first stop the fighting. I think that's that's a prerequisite to dealing with this.
Rafif, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I would like to put things in perspective for your listeners, your viewers, and your guest. Let's not forget that the Assad regime continues to rain down barrel bombs on civilians. The Assad regime continues to forcibly displace civilians. Most of these civilians are women and children. Of course, there are many parties involved in the conflict in Syria, but to address the problem, you have to go to the root cause, which is the Assad regime, period.
And Mahdi, when I was referring to the refugees, I was also talking about those who are in neighboring countries like Lebanon, like Turkey, like Jordan. Some of them have got into such a desperate situation right now that they want to return to Syria despite the conditions that exist in the country right now. Shouldn't the government then be offering them some kind of safe passage to return to the places they came from?
Well, I'd also like to put this into historical perspective. I've been to Syria and I've been to Lebanon. I've seen refugees and internally displaced in both countries. Before I even address that, I want to bring up the strategy that's been used by these opposition militias. Once again, the Free Syrian Army, al-Nusra, ISIL, other groups. Their strategy has deliberately involved going into civilian areas and not leaving. If we take a historical look at real revolutionary movements or resistance movements, they don't hide amongst civilian populations and deliberately use it as a strategy to bring casualties up to try as a way to get the international community involved. Look at the Viet Cong, where they always stayed out of the villages, so the civilians there wouldn't get hurt. And if you want to take a closer look at home next to Syria, look at Lebanon. Look at Hezbollah when it was fighting the Israelis. It never stayed in the villages in the south. It left where it could. And that's why I'm being categorical and saying it's deliberate, because where they've always had opportunities to leave civilian areas, they deliberately didn't. So you can't compare it to, let's say, Hamas, where it can't leave Gaza, and the Israelis say, oh, they're hiding amongst civilians. But and I don't want to talk about the political opposition. I'm talking about the opposition militias, like the Free Syrian Army. They deliberately go into towns and villages and stay there as a means of creating casualties. They've been it's been very deliberate strategy.
Rafif, is that the case, that the militias are among the civilian population? So when the government's fighting them, civilians are getting caught in the crossfire?
Certainly there are many instances where, particularly ISIS, ISIL, Jabhat al-Nusra, absolutely. I will point you to the fact that the Free Syrian Army signed a code of conduct based on international laws and the Geneva Conventions. I'm not going to define the Syrian revolution in the context of other movements around the world. I cannot put the Syrian case into a cookie-cutter model. This is about Syria. It's not just about having visited a refugee camp or two or having been to Syria and Lebanon. There is a huge humanitarian crisis. It is compounded by the fact that the regime continues to attack civilians. You don't have to go back too far. You can look at the Geneva II talks, in which we were trying to engage in a political process, and the regime was deliberately starving the residents of Homs. You can go all around Syria and see the signs of starve or surrender. This is a forced starvation campaign across the country, and we're not even talking about the people who are forcibly displaced externally.
Mahdi, when we look at the Syrian government agenda and what it needs to do right now, how much of a priority are these 7 million people, many of whom have been displaced internally, as you point out, also those who are refugees in neighboring countries?
Well, first of all, I'd like to bring into account that a lot of the information I get is from the local coordinate committees in Lebanon, which your other guest says she's a speaker for, and they condemn, they've actually many times cited the Free Syrian Army and the other militias as being involved in the killing of civilians themselves. So the organization she's the spokesman for in English is one of the sources for my information about
we'll
this.
Need to correct the
They've
record
condemned
here.
the Free Syrian.
We'll need to correct the record here, but please continue.
Go ahead, Mahdi. I'll get back to Rafif in a moment.
It's the local coordination committees that have talked about, for example, the Free Syrian Army kidnapping and ransoming civilians there. I mean, and it's also a non-interventionist movement. I'm very well aware of their work about how they've...
So first of all, I'm the spokesperson and not the spokesman. Second of all, we have condemned every armed militia that has used civilians, every single one. But your focus,
including the
Free Syrian Army, but your single-minded focus on the
I'm glad you acknowledge that.
Absolutely. But your single-minded focus on the Free Syrian Army and other militias, and your failure to assign any blame to the regime is astounding, particularly at a time when there are 7 million internally displaced and some 4 million refugees in neighboring countries.
Rafif, let me ask you this.
Madam, I said there's plenty of blame to go around, so I'm not particularly pointing the finger at the government for being carefree. There's plenty of blame to go around, but what I'm pointing out is that this cannot squarely be put on the shoulders of the Syrian government. Who's sending weapons in? Who are the ones that are instigating this? You know, there's a lot of political movements, politicization of this refugee problem. You know, before this incident happened, there was over 1 million Iraqi refugees and millions in the entire region. And who sent them there? The United States. Nobody was shedding crocodile tears for them. The Syrian government actually helped them more than any other regional government. Okay, and it's helped the Palestinian refugees more than any other government. But when it comes now to these Syrian refugees, and believe me, their conditions are terrible. I'm not here saying that they're living on beds of roses. I condemn what's happening. But when it comes to these Syrian refugees, everything's being politicized. And why is that? With the ultimate goal of regime change in Damascus.
Okay, Rafif, you get the last word.
Well, yes, thank you. The ultimate goal of the revolution was freedom, justice, dignity for all, and part of that is regime change. So absolutely, the ultimate goal for Syrians is regime change in Damascus. But to go back
And the United States and
I'm not
Israel.
discussing U.S. foreign policy. I'm not here to discuss conspiracy theories. I'm here to discuss Syrians,
Those
their
aren't
plight,
conspiracy
and their
theories.
future.
If you look at
and if I
the
might
United
continue,
Nations Security
just
Council was
one
just
moment,
given a
please.
report saying Israel collaborates
All
with
right, just one
the
moment.
insurgency.
Rafif, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Ultimately, the goal is for freedom and dignity for all Syrians, and that necessarily involves a transition away from the regime of Bashar al-Assad and into civilian hands.
And we have run out of time. Thank you to both of you for being with us. That's all we have time for. But the conversation continues online. We want to hear your thoughts on this discussion or any other shows. So chat with us on Twitter at @CCTV_America or join us on Facebook at CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being here.